The morning sun cast long shadows across the polished marble floor of First National Bank as customers began their daily routines. Margaret Wheeler, the branch manager, stood behind the customer service counter with her arms crossed, surveying her domain with the sharp eyes of someone who had spent 15 years climbing the corporate ladder. At 42, she prided herself on running the tightest ship in the entire banking network. Her perfectly pressed navy suit, her hair pulled back in a severe bun, and her no-nonsense attitude had earned her a reputation as someone who didn't tolerate any disruption to the smooth operation of her branch. The morning rush was just beginning when the automatic doors slid open with their familiar whoosh. Margaret's attention was drawn to a young boy who walked in alone. Wearing a faded denim jacket that had seen better days, sneakers with scuffed toes, and jeans with a small tear at the knee. The boy couldn't have been more than 12 years old, with tousled brown hair that looked like he had just rolled out of bed. He carried a worn backpack slung over one shoulder and walked with the casual confidence of youth, seemingly unaware of the stares he was attracting from the other customers. Margaret immediately felt her jaw tighten. This was exactly the kind of situation that made her nervous. Unaccompanied minors in banks usually meant trouble. They were either lost, causing disruptions, or worse, potential security risks. She had dealt with enough troublemakers over the years to recognize the warning signs, and this kid was definitely not the type of client she wanted in her pristine banking environment. The boy approached the information desk where Sarah Martinez, one of the newer tellers, was stationed. Sarah was young, barely out of college, and still had that naive optimism that Margaret had long since abandoned. The kid walked up to her with a friendly smile that immediately put Sarah at ease. "Hi there," the boy said politely. "I need to make a withdrawal from my account, please." Sarah smiled back warmly. "Of course. Do you have your account information with you?" The boy reached into his backpack and pulled out a crumpled piece of paper with some numbers written on it in careful handwriting. "My dad wrote down the account number for me. He said I could take out some money for my school project." Margaret watched this exchange from across the room, her suspicion growing with each passing second. A kid with a handwritten account number? This had scam written all over it. She had seen it before. Young people trying to access accounts they had no business touching, often coached by adults who wanted to avoid being caught on the bank's security cameras themselves. Sarah took the paper and began typing the account number into her computer. As she worked, she made pleasant small talk with the boy. "What kind of school project are you working on?" "I'm building a model of the solar system for science class," the boy replied enthusiastically. "I need to buy some special materials that are kind of expensive, but my dad said it was important to do a good job on schoolwork." "That sounds really cool," Sarah said, still typing. "I loved science class when I was your age." Margaret had heard enough. She strode across the marble floor, her high heels clicking authoritatively with each step. The sound was sharp and commanding, causing several customers to look up from their business. When she reached the information desk, she placed her hand firmly on the counter and fixed the boy with a stern stare. "Excuse me," she said in her most official voice. "Is there a problem here?" Sarah looked up, slightly confused. "Oh, no problem at all, Ms. Wheeler. This young man is just making a withdrawal." "I see," Margaret said, her tone dripping with skepticism. She turned her attention to the boy, who was now looking somewhat uncomfortable under her intense gaze. "And you are?" "I'm Tyler," the boy said simply. "Tyler Harrison." "Tyler Harrison," Margaret repeated, as if testing the name for authenticity. "And you're here alone to make a withdrawal?" "Yes, ma'am. My dad is at work, but he said it would be okay for me to come by myself since the bank is only a few blocks from my school." Margaret's eyebrows shot up. "Your father sent you, a child, to handle banking business by yourself." Her voice carried a tone of disbelief mixed with indignation. "That seems highly unusual and, frankly, inappropriate." Tyler shifted uncomfortably, but maintained his polite demeanor. He's really busy with meetings today, and I promised I'd be responsible. I've been to banks before with him. I'm sure you have, Margaret said dryly. She turned to Sarah, who was looking increasingly uncomfortable with the direction the conversation was taking. Sarah, what exactly is the situation with this account? Sarah glanced at her computer screen, then back at Margaret. Well, I was just pulling up the account information. The number he provided appears to be valid and— Appears to be valid? Margaret interrupted. That's not good enough. We need to be absolutely certain about these matters, especially when dealing with minors who show up unaccompanied with handwritten account numbers. Tyler's cheeks began to redden slightly. I'm not trying to do anything wrong. My dad really did give me permission. Margaret studied the boy more carefully, taking in his modest clothing and casual appearance. Everything about this situation screamed trouble to her experienced eye. In her 15 years of banking, she had learned to trust her instincts, and her instincts were telling her that something was not right about this whole scenario. Young man, she said, her voice becoming more authoritative, I'm going to need you to step aside while we verify this information properly. Sarah, I want you to run a complete check on this account and cross-reference it with our security protocols. But, Ms. Wheeler, Sarah protested gently, I haven't even finished pulling up the account details yet. Maybe if we just— I think I've been clear about what I want done, Margaret said sharply, cutting off any further discussion. She had not gotten to her position by being soft or by giving people the benefit of the doubt when red flags were flying. Tyler looked from Margaret to Sarah, clearly sensing the tension that was building. Is there a problem? I can call my dad if you need to talk to him. Oh, I'm sure you could call someone, Margaret said with barely concealed sarcasm. The question is whether that someone would actually be your father or just another person involved in whatever scheme this is. Scheme? Tyler's voice cracked slightly with confusion and the first hints of distress. I don't understand. I'm just trying to get money for my school project like my dad said I could. By now, the conversation had begun to attract attention from other customers in the bank. Several people had stopped their own business to watch the unfolding drama, and Margaret could feel their eyes on her. She was acutely aware that she was being observed, and this only strengthened her resolve to handle the situation properly and by the book. Sarah, she said, still addressing her subordinate while keeping her eyes fixed on Tyler. I want you to put a hold on any transactions related to this account until we can verify the legitimacy of this request, and I want you to check our records for any previous incidents involving this individual or this account number. Tyler's confusion was now clearly mixed with the beginning of panic. Previous incidents? I've never been in trouble at a bank before. I've never been in trouble anywhere before. Margaret felt a familiar surge of satisfaction that came with taking control of a potentially problematic situation. This was exactly why she had been promoted to branch manager. She had the experience and judgment to spot trouble before it could escalate into something worse. Ma'am, Tyler tried again, his voice now noticeably shaky. Could I please just call my dad? I think there's been some kind of misunderstanding. I think there certainly has been a misunderstanding, Margaret agreed coldly. The misunderstanding is that you thought you could walk into my bank and conduct suspicious financial transactions without proper verification? Sarah was now looking genuinely distressed by the turn of events. Ms. Wheeler, maybe we should just let him make the phone call. It might clear everything up quickly. Sarah, I appreciate your concern, but I'm the branch manager here, and I make the decisions about how to handle security matters, Margaret replied firmly. This situation has too many red flags for us to simply take this young man's word for anything. Tyler was now visibly upset, his eyes beginning to show the telltale moisture that suggested tears were not far away. Please, I just want to call my dad. He can explain everything. Margaret looked at the boy's distressed face and felt a momentary flicker of something that might have been sympathy, but she quickly pushed it aside. She had learned long ago that emotional manipulation was often part of these kinds of scams, and she was not going to be fooled by a few crocodile tears. "Here's what's going to happen," she announced, her voice carrying the full weight of her authority. "I'm going to call security, and we're going to sort this out properly through the appropriate channels. If everything is as legitimate as you claim, then you have nothing to worry about." The word security seemed to hit Tyler like a physical blow. His face went pale, and his voice cracked as he spoke. "Security? But I haven't done anything wrong." "That remains to be seen," Margaret said, already reaching for the phone at the customer service desk. "In situations like this, it's better to be safe than sorry." As Margaret began to dial the number for bank security, Tyler took a step backward, his young mind clearly struggling to process what was happening to him. The simple errand that his father had trusted him to complete was rapidly turning into a nightmare, and he had no idea how to make it stop. The other customers in the bank had now formed a loose circle around the unfolding drama, some looking concerned, others appearing merely curious about the spectacle. The low murmur of their whispered conversations created a background buzz that only added to Tyler's growing sense of panic and humiliation. Sarah made one last attempt to de-escalate the situation. "Ms. Wheeler, are you sure this is necessary? Maybe we could just—" "Sarah, I need you to let me handle this," Margaret said firmly, holding up one hand to silence her subordinate while pressing the phone to her ear with the other. "Security? Yes. This is Margaret Wheeler at the downtown branch. I have a situation here that requires immediate attention." Tyler stood frozen in place, watching in horror as his simple banking errand transformed into something that felt like a scene from a crime drama. He had never been in trouble with authority figures before, and the experience of being treated as a suspect was completely outside his realm of experience. The next few minutes would prove to be a turning point, not just for Tyler, but for everyone involved in this rapidly escalating situation that had begun with nothing more than a young boy trying to withdraw money for a school project. The security guard who responded to Margaret's call was a large man named Frank Rodriguez, who had worked bank security for over a decade. Frank had seen his share of unusual situations, but when he walked into the main banking area and saw a clearly distressed 12-year-old boy surrounded by curious onlookers, he couldn't help but raise an eyebrow. This was definitely not what he had been expecting when he received the call about a security situation. Margaret immediately approached Frank as soon as he entered the bank, her stride confident and purposeful. She had dealt with Frank before and knew he was someone who understood the importance of following proper procedures and maintaining the bank's security standards. "Frank, thank you for getting here so quickly," she said, extending her hand in a professional greeting. "We have a situation with this minor who showed up alone, claiming to have permission to access a bank account with only a handwritten account number as verification." Frank looked past Margaret to where Tyler stood near the customer service desk, his face flushed with embarrassment, and his eyes darting nervously between the adults who seemed to be making decisions about his fate. The boy was clearly scared, and Frank's instincts as both a security professional and a father of two told him that this kid didn't look like trouble. He looked like he was in trouble. "What exactly has he done?" Frank asked Margaret, keeping his voice low and professional. "He's attempting to access a bank account without proper authorization," Margaret explained, her tone suggesting that she considered this a serious offense. "The whole situation is highly suspicious. A child, unaccompanied, with handwritten account information, claiming his father gave him permission to make withdrawals. It has all the hallmarks of fraud." Frank nodded slowly, taking in Margaret's assessment while continuing to observe Tyler. The boy caught his eye and gave him a small, hopeful wave, as if greeting the security guard might somehow help his situation. The gesture was so innocently childlike that Frank found it hard to believe this kid was involved in any kind of sophisticated banking fraud. Has anyone attempted to verify his story by contacting the account holder? Frank asked. Margaret's expression tightened slightly. We're following proper security protocols. When we have reasonable suspicion of fraudulent activity, we don't simply take the suspect's word for anything. That's how banks get taken advantage of. Tyler, who had been listening to this conversation with growing anxiety, took a tentative step forward. "Excuse me," he said, his voice small but determined. "Could I please just call my dad now? I think if you talk to him, this would all get cleared up really fast." Margaret turned to face Tyler with an expression that made it clear she did not appreciate being interrupted. "Young man, I've already explained that we have procedures to follow. Making unauthorized phone calls is not part of those procedures." "But it's not unauthorized," Tyler protested, his voice getting slightly louder as his frustration began to overcome his fear. "It's my dad. I'm allowed to call my dad anytime I want." Frank could see that the situation was escalating in a way that wasn't helping anyone. He had been in law enforcement before moving into private security, and he had learned that sometimes the best way to resolve a problem was to gather information rather than make assumptions. "Margaret," he said carefully, "what's the harm in letting the kid make a phone call? If he's running some kind of scam, talking to his father will expose it pretty quickly. And if he's legitimate, we can clear this up and get back to normal business?" Margaret looked at Frank as if he had just suggested they hand over the keys to the vault. "Frank, I appreciate your input, but I've been managing this branch for 15 years. I know how to spot trouble, and I know how these scams work. They always have an answer for everything. They always have someone they can call who will back up their story." "With respect, Margaret," Frank said, his tone remaining professional but firm, "this kid doesn't look like a master criminal to me. He looks scared and confused." Tyler seized on this small sign of support. "Thank you," he said to Frank, his voice cracking slightly with emotion. "I really am just trying to get money for my school project. My dad is James Harrison, and he works—" "Stop right there," Margaret interrupted sharply. "I don't want to hear any more of your story until we've had a chance to verify the facts independently." Frank was beginning to feel uncomfortable with Margaret's approach to the situation. He had dealt with actual criminals, and Tyler's behavior was nothing like what he would expect from someone trying to commit fraud. The boy was nervous, yes, but it was the nervousness of someone who was confused and scared, not the nervous energy of someone trying to maintain a lie. "Margaret, I really think we should let him make the phone call," Frank said. "It's a simple way to verify his story, and if something seems off about the call, we can take it from there." Before Margaret could respond, Sarah, who had been quietly observing the entire exchange, finally spoke up. "Ms. Wheeler, I've been looking at the account information, and there's something I think you should see." Margaret turned to Sarah with barely concealed irritation. "What is it?" Sarah glanced nervously between Margaret and Tyler before continuing. "The account number the boy provided is legitimate. It's an active account with a substantial balance, and the name on the account is James Harrison." "That doesn't prove anything," Margaret said dismissively. "Account information can be stolen. Numbers can be copied. Just because he has a real account number doesn't mean he has authorization to access it." Tyler's face lit up with hope at Sarah's words. "See? That's my dad's account. James Harrison is my dad's name." Margaret whirled around to face Tyler. "Anyone could have gotten that information. You could have copied it from a check, or overheard it, or gotten it from someone else who had access to it." Frank was beginning to lose patience with Margaret's stubborn refusal to consider that Tyler might be telling the truth. "Margaret, why don't we just call the number associated with the account and verify the boy's identity? This is taking way more time than it needs to." "Because that's not how we handle security matters," Margaret snapped. "We don't just start calling random numbers because a suspect tells us to. We follow established protocols." Tyler looked back and forth between the adults who were arguing about him as if he weren't standing right there. The whole situation felt surreal to him. An hour ago, he had been a normal kid walking to the bank to get money for a school project. Now he was being treated like a criminal, and no one seemed willing to listen to him or believe what he was saying. "Please," Tyler said, his voice now openly desperate. "I just want to call my dad. I don't understand why that's not allowed. I'm not trying to do anything wrong." The desperation in Tyler's voice seemed to affect some of the bank customers who were still watching the unfolding drama. An elderly woman who had been standing in line approached the group cautiously. "Excuse me," she said politely but firmly, "but I couldn't help but overhear what's happening here. This young man doesn't look like a criminal to me. He looks like a scared child who just wants to call his father." Margaret turned to face the elderly woman with a look of exasperation. "Ma'am, I appreciate your concern, but this is a bank security matter, and it doesn't involve you." "Actually, it does involve me," the woman replied with surprising steel in her voice. "I'm a customer of this bank, and I'm watching you treat a child like a criminal without even giving him the courtesy of making a phone call to verify his story. That's not the kind of customer service I expect from my bank." Several other customers murmured their agreement, and Margaret could feel the mood in the bank shifting against her. This was exactly the kind of situation she had hoped to avoid, but now she felt trapped by her own decisions. If she backed down now, she would look weak and indecisive. If she continued on her current course, she risked alienating her customers and creating an even bigger scene. Frank could see that the situation was spiraling out of control, and he decided to take matters into his own hands. "Tyler," he said, addressing the boy directly, "what's your father's phone number?" Tyler immediately recited a number from memory, his face showing the first signs of hope he had felt since walking into the bank. Margaret stepped forward quickly. "Frank, I don't think this is appropriate. We should be following—" "Margaret," Frank said, cutting her off with uncharacteristic firmness, "I'm going to make this phone call. If the boy is lying, we'll know in about 30 seconds. If he's telling the truth, we've just put a kid through hell for no reason." Margaret's face flushed red with anger and embarrassment. "Frank, I'm the branch manager here, and I'm telling you that I don't want you to make that call." Frank looked at Margaret for a long moment, then at Tyler's hopeful face, then at the crowd of customers who were all watching this confrontation with obvious disapproval. He had worked security long enough to know when a situation had gone beyond reasonable precautions and entered the territory of poor judgment. "Margaret," he said quietly but firmly, "I'm making the call." Tyler felt a surge of relief wash over him as Frank pulled out his cell phone and began dialing the number Tyler had provided. For the first time since this nightmare had started, someone was actually listening to him and taking his words seriously. Margaret stood with her arms crossed, her jaw clenched tight with frustration and anger. She felt like her authority was being undermined, and she didn't like it one bit. In her mind, she was still convinced that she was handling this situation correctly, and that Frank and the customers were all being naive and potentially putting the bank at risk. Frank put the phone to his ear and waited for someone to answer. Tyler held his breath, praying that his father would pick up and that this whole misunderstanding would finally be resolved. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times. Tyler's anxiety began to build again as he worried about what would happen if his father didn't answer. Would they believe him then? Would they call the police? On the 4th ring, a professional male voice answered the phone. "James Harrison speaking." Frank felt a wave of relief. "Mr. Harrison." "This is Frank Rodriguez with security at First National Bank downtown. I have a young man here named Tyler who says he's your son, and he's trying to make a withdrawal from your account. Can you verify his identity and confirm whether he has your permission to be here?" There was a brief pause on the other end of the line, and Frank could hear the sound of papers shuffling and what might have been a chair creaking. "Tyler is at the bank?" James Harrison's voice carried a note of concern. Is everything all right? He should have been able to handle a simple withdrawal without any problems. Frank felt his stomach sink as he realized the implications of what he was hearing. Sir, can you confirm that Tyler Harrison is your son, and that you gave him permission to withdraw money from your account today? Of course I can confirm that, James Harrison replied, his voice now showing clear signs of irritation. Tyler is my 12-year-old son, and I specifically told him he could withdraw up to $200 from my account for his school science project. Who am I speaking with again? And why are you asking these questions? Frank looked at Margaret, who was still standing with her arms crossed, her expression now showing the first hints of uncertainty. Sir, I'm with bank security, and there seems to have been some confusion about your son's authorization to access your account. What kind of confusion? James Harrison's voice was becoming sharper. My son is a responsible kid, and I gave him explicit permission to withdraw money. What exactly is the problem here? Frank could feel the weight of every eye in the bank on him as he prepared to explain how they had treated Tyler. Sir, I think it might be better if you spoke directly with the branch manager. Could you hold on for a moment? Margaret could see where this conversation was heading, and for the first time since the whole situation had started, she began to feel a gnawing sense that she might have made a serious error in judgment. Frank extended his phone toward Margaret, but she hesitated to take it. The confident authority she had displayed throughout the morning was beginning to crack as the reality of the situation started to sink in. The phone seemed to hang in the air between them for several long seconds before she finally reached out and accepted it with a slightly trembling hand. This is Margaret Wheeler, branch manager, she said into the phone, trying to maintain her professional composure despite the growing knot in her stomach. Ms. Wheeler, James Harrison's voice came through clearly, and there was an edge to it that made Margaret's anxiety spike even higher. I want to understand exactly what has happened here. My son went to your bank with my explicit permission to withdraw money from my account, and apparently your security has been called because someone thought he was committing fraud? Margaret cleared her throat nervously. Sir, we have strict security protocols here at the bank, and when we see unusual situations, we have to investigate them thoroughly. A young child coming in alone with only handwritten account information raised some red flags for us. Red flags? James Harrison's voice rose slightly. My 12-year-old son, who I specifically sent to the bank with written instructions, raised red flags because he's young. Well, sir, it's not just his age, Margaret said, acutely aware that every person in the bank was listening to her side of this conversation. It's the combination of factors: his age, his appearance, the informal nature of the account information he provided. We have to be cautious about these things. There was a long pause on the other end of the line, and when James Harrison spoke again, his voice was dangerously quiet. His appearance? What exactly do you mean by that, Ms. Wheeler? Margaret felt heat rising in her cheeks. I just meant that he looked casual, not like someone who would typically be conducting banking business. Not like someone who would typically be conducting banking business, James Harrison repeated slowly. Are you suggesting that my son looked too poor to have access to a bank account? The accusation hit Margaret like a physical blow, and she found herself struggling to find words that would explain her actions without making them sound as prejudiced as they clearly were. Sir, that's not what I meant at all. We simply have to be careful about security matters. Security matters, James Harrison said, his voice now carrying a tone of cold anger that made Margaret's hands shake. Ms. Wheeler, let me ask you a direct question. If my son had walked into your bank wearing expensive clothes and looking like he came from money, would you have called security on him? Margaret opened her mouth to deny it, but no words came out. The honest answer was no. If Tyler had looked like he came from wealth, she probably would have assumed he had every right to be there and would have processed his transaction without a second thought. The realization of her own bias was hitting her like a sledgehammer. Sir, we follow the same procedures for everyone, she finally managed to say, but even she could hear how hollow the words sounded. No, Ms. Wheeler, you clearly don't, James Harrison replied, because if you followed the same procedures for everyone, you would have verified my son's identity by making a simple phone call before subjecting him to interrogation and calling security. Instead, you made assumptions based on how he looked and how old he is. Tyler, who had been listening to his father's side of the conversation with growing relief and vindication, felt tears starting to form in his eyes. But this time, they were tears of gratitude rather than fear. Finally, someone with authority was standing up for him and pointing out how wrong this whole situation had been. Margaret could feel the disapproving stares of every customer and employee in the bank boring into her. The elderly woman who had spoken up earlier was shaking her head with obvious disgust, and Sarah was looking at her with a mixture of disappointment and embarrassment. Sir, Margaret tried again, I understand you're upset, but I was simply trying to protect the bank's interests and— Protect the bank's interests? James Harrison interrupted, his voice rising again. Ms. Wheeler, do you have any idea who you're talking to? Margaret felt her stomach drop. There was something in his tone that suggested this conversation was about to take an even more serious turn. Sir, you said you were James Harrison. That's right, I'm James Harrison. And do you know what my job is, Ms. Wheeler? Margaret's mouth went dry. She had a terrible feeling that she was about to learn something that would make this already disastrous situation even worse. No, sir. I don't know what your job is. I'm the Chief Executive Officer of First National Bank, Ms. Wheeler. I'm your boss's boss's boss. And you just spent the last hour treating my son like a criminal because he didn't look wealthy enough to deserve decent customer service. The phone nearly slipped from Margaret's hands. The blood drained from her face so quickly that Frank thought she might faint. Around the bank, customers who had overheard this revelation began whispering to each other with obvious shock and no small amount of satisfaction at seeing the branch manager get her comeuppance. Mr. Harrison, Margaret stammered, I had no idea that Tyler was your son. If you had known what? James Harrison cut her off sharply. If you had known he was the CEO's son, you would have treated him with respect? Ms. Wheeler, that's exactly the problem. Every customer who walks into our bank deserves to be treated with dignity and respect, regardless of who their father is or how much money they appear to have. Margaret was now visibly shaking. Her 15-year career at the bank, her reputation, her future, everything seemed to be crumbling around her in real time. Sir, I sincerely apologize. I was just trying to follow security protocols. No, Ms. Wheeler, you weren't following security protocols. Security protocols involve verification and investigation, not assumptions and prejudice. If you had been following actual protocols, you would have checked the account information, verified Tyler's identity, and confirmed his authorization through proper channels. Instead, you saw a young boy in modest clothing and decided he must be up to no good. Frank cleared his throat softly. Mr. Harrison, if I may interject, I tried to encourage Ms. Wheeler to let Tyler make the phone call earlier, but she insisted on following what she called proper procedures. Thank you for that information, Mr. Rodriguez, James Harrison replied. And thank you for ultimately making the call that resolved this situation. I'll make sure that your willingness to use common sense and treat my son fairly is noted in your file. Tyler finally found his voice again. Dad, I just wanted to get the money for my science project like you said I could. I didn't do anything wrong. James Harrison's voice immediately softened when he spoke to his son. Tyler, you didn't do anything wrong at all. You handled yourself very well in a difficult situation, and I'm proud of how polite and patient you were, even when you were being treated unfairly. Margaret felt another wave of shame wash over her as she listened to this father comfort his son after the ordeal she had put him through. Mr. Harrison, Please know that I never intended for this situation to escalate the way it did. I was genuinely trying to protect the bank." "Ms. Wheeler," James Harrison said, his voice returning to its previous cold professionalism, "protecting the bank means providing excellent customer service to all of our clients, not harassing children who have every right to be there. What happened here today is the exact opposite of protecting the bank. It's damaging our reputation and creating the kind of negative experience that drives customers away." Margaret knew he was right. Already she could see some of the customers looking around the bank with expressions that suggested they were reconsidering their choice of financial institution. The elderly woman who had defended Tyler earlier was speaking quietly to the customer next to her, and Margaret caught enough of the conversation to know they were discussing taking their business elsewhere. "What happens now?" Margaret asked quietly, dreading the answer. "Now, Ms. Wheeler, you're going to personally ensure that Tyler gets the money he came for, and you're going to apologize to him properly. After that, you and I are going to have a very serious discussion about judgment, customer service, and the values that this bank is supposed to represent." Margaret nodded, even though James Harrison couldn't see her through the phone. "Yes, sir. Of course. And Ms. Wheeler, I want you to think very carefully about what happened here today, because this conversation isn't over. I'll be coming down to the branch personally within the hour to follow up on this incident." Margaret's heart sank even further. "Yes, sir, I understand. Now put Tyler back on the phone, please." Margaret handed the phone to Tyler with shaking hands. Tyler took it eagerly, relief flooding his young face. "Hi, Dad." "Hi, kiddo. Are you okay?" Tyler looked around at all the adults who had been making his life difficult for the past hour, and for the first time since entering the bank, he smiled. "I'm okay now. It was pretty scary for a while, though." "I bet it was. You handled it like a champ, though. I'm sorry you had to go through that." "It's not your fault, Dad. Some people just don't listen very well." James Harrison chuckled despite the seriousness of the situation. "That's a very diplomatic way to put it, son. Now, are you still able to get the money for your project, or do you need me to come down there right now?" Tyler looked at Margaret, who was standing nearby looking pale and defeated. "I think they're going to help me now." "Good. Get your money, buy your supplies, and I'll see you at home tonight. We'll talk more about what happened then." "Okay, Dad. I love you." "I love you too, Tyler." "And Tyler, I'm proud of you for staying calm and polite even when things got difficult." Tyler handed the phone back to Frank, who closed it and put it back in his pocket. The bank had fallen unusually quiet, with everyone processing what they had just witnessed. Margaret took a deep breath and approached Tyler. For the first time since he had walked into the bank, she looked at him not as a potential threat or problem, but as what he actually was, a polite, well-mannered child who had been trying to complete a simple errand for his father. "Tyler," she said, her voice much softer than it had been all morning, "I owe you a sincere apology. I made assumptions about you that were wrong and unfair, and I treated you badly because of those assumptions. That was not acceptable, and I'm very sorry." Tyler looked up at her with the kind of generous spirit that children often possess. "It's okay, Ms. Wheeler. People make mistakes sometimes." Margaret felt tears prick at her eyes. This boy, who had every right to be angry with her, was showing her more grace and understanding than she had shown him. "Thank you for saying that, Tyler, but what I did wasn't just a mistake. It was wrong. You deserved better treatment from the moment you walked in here." Sarah, who had been watching this entire exchange with a mixture of relief and lingering shock, finally spoke up. "Tyler, why don't we get that withdrawal taken care of for you now?" Tyler nodded eagerly. "That would be great. I still need to get to the art supply store before it closes." As Sarah began processing Tyler's withdrawal, Margaret stood back and watched, contemplating the lessons of the morning. In less than 2 hours, Her assumptions and prejudices had nearly destroyed her career and had definitely damaged the reputation of the bank she had thought she was protecting. The elderly customer who had spoken up earlier approached Margaret as Tyler completed his transaction. "You know," she said quietly, "I've been banking here for over 20 years, and I've never seen anything like what happened here today." Margaret braced herself for another criticism, but the woman surprised her. "That boy showed more class and dignity in the last 5 minutes than most adults would have shown in his situation. His father should be proud. And well, you have some thinking to do about what kind of person you want to be." As Tyler left the bank with his money, waving goodbye to Sarah and even giving Margaret a small smile, Margaret realized that this day had changed her in ways she was only beginning to understand. The sound of the automatic doors closing behind him marked the end of one of the most humbling experiences of her professional life.